Hi everyone. So recently I went to Lumbini in Nepal, which is billed as the Buddha's birthplace. And it might actually well be the Buddha's birthplace. But I went there very naively. I didn't know much about the site. But I did two short videos on my phone. One about the Lumbini inscription, the Lumbini pillar, which supposedly was put up by Ashoka in the 3rd century BC, and which is one of our key pieces of evidence that Lumbini is indeed the Buddha's birthplace. And another short video about the context of the Buddha's birth, the world that the Buddha was born into, a world of small city-states and associations. After I did these two short videos, though, I checked some of the details and I realized that I'd actually stumbled into this very complex topic, one that's quite controversial. For a start, there's controversy over whether the Lumbini inscription is really authentic, whether it really was put there by Ashoka in the 3rd century BC, or whether it's actually a forgery put there by a renegade German scholar in the 19th century AD. And of course, if the Lumbini inscription isn't genuine, then that might mean that Lumbini isn't, after all, the birthplace of the Buddha. The Buddha may not have actually been born in Nepal at all, but rather in India. So I decided to look into all this, and I made a video which is actually composed of those two short clips, plus a lot of other material. So I'm going to start with the first clip that I made, just talking about the Lumbini inscription, and then I'll go into the Lumbini inscription and its discovery. I'll talk about issues of authenticity. So these are things that might be consistent with an authentic inscription from the 3rd century BC, but that might also point towards this being a forged document from the 19th century AD. So we'll go through all that. Then I'll put the next video, the second short clip that I did on site, and that'll take us into the topic of the world the Buddha was born into. And that's really the necessary context that we'll need to come back to this question at the end. Was Buddha born in Nepal? Was Buddha born in India? Does that question even make sense? But before all that, I'm going to start with the first short clip of me standing just in front of the Lumbini pillar and just to the side of the temple marking the spot where the Buddha was supposedly born. Okay, and here we are next to the very holy site where the Buddha was supposedly born in the 6th century BC. And the reason we think we know this is because it's mentioned in some Buddhist texts, but we also have this magnificent pillar. So this pillar was put up in the 3rd century BC by Ashoka the great Buddhist king who converted to Buddhism after a campaign produced lots of bloodshed. And we think we know that because he talks about it on his pillars. He put these pillars up all around India. Some on the borderlands were in languages like Greek and Aramaic so that the people living there could understand those pillars. And here's an example. This pillar was actually rediscovered in 1896. And it talks about how Lumbini was the birthplace of the Buddha. So that's why we think this is the birthplace of the Buddha, and that's why this site is still so revered. Okay, so this is the Lumbini pillar. It was seen by a Chinese pilgrim, Xuanzang, in the 7th century. He described it as surmounted by a horse, but also broken into two pieces. Xuanzang doesn't mention an inscription, and that's very fishy because Xuanzang's a Chinese Buddhist pilgrim. He's very interested in anything to do with the life of Buddha. The fact that he doesn't mention that inscription probably means he didn't see one. By the 19th century, this pillar was pretty much buried, but the top of it was still mostly visible, so the lower part of the inscription was underground. However, a local landowner, obviously a British landowner in India called Duncan Ricketts, showed it to Vincent A. Smith around 1884, Vincent A. Smith being a very distinguished British historian of India. And at this point, this other scholar, this mercurial figure, Alois Anton Führer, also hears about the pillar in early 1895. And in late 1895, Führer and this man, Khadga Shamshir Kunwar Rana, who at one point is the head of the Nepalese armed forces, they locate the pillar. And I say they because it's disputed who sees the pillar first, who really discovers the pillar. But both Khadga Shamshir Kunwar Rana and Alois Anton Führer are involved. And some Nepalese workers dig down around the pillar's base and they show what's on the lower part of the pillar. They reveal what's there, and this apparently is what's there. This is what they apparently discovered on that day. An ancient inscription written in the Brahmi script, successor of modern Indian scripts such as Devanagari. And here's a close-up of the inscription. It's pretty short, so we might as well just read through the translation. When King Devanapriya Priyardasan had been anointed 20 years, it says, he came himself and worshipped this spot because the Buddha Shakyamuni was born here. He both caused to be made a stone bearing a horse and caused a stone pillar to be set up in order to show that the Blessed One was born here. He made the village of Lumbini free of taxes and paying only an eighth share of the produce. Okay, so Devanapriya Priyardasan is a familiar epithet for Ashoka, the great Buddhist emperor. It's familiar from other inscriptions. And so this is telling us about what Ashoka did. He came and worshipped the spot because the Buddha Shakyamuni being the sage of the Shakyas, the clan that the Buddha was born into, was born here. Note the stone bearing a horse, which Xuanzang, the Chinese pilgrim that we mentioned a moment ago, also describes. And the name Lumbini is also something to note. That's the place name Lumbini that we have in the Nida Nikatha, the introduction to the Jataka Tales, which is another key piece of evidence for where the Buddha was born. Now, I'm not a scholar in this field. There are whole books written about this and other issues to do with the birth of the Buddha and to do with Alois Anton Führer, especially Charles Allen's book, The Buddha and Dr. Führer, which I'll put underneath the video in the further reading. But I did just look up this whole issue on the internet after going to the site, and Wikipedia has a list of issues of authenticity because, I went to the site thinking, oh, this is the authentic inscription describing where the Buddha's birthplace is. And maybe it is, but also maybe it isn't. So let's just work through these. So number one, as listed on Wikipedia, the Lumbini inscription is in the third person. It says, written by someone reporting a past visit of Devanapriya Priyardasi, and is not written Devanapriya Priyardasi's own name, contrary to all other known edicts of Ashoka. I'm a little bit unclear about what the objection is there, because if you look up other edicts put out by Ashoka, other inscriptions put up by Ashoka, they do seem to regularly refer to him in the third person. So this is the most famous one of all, Rock Edict 13. It describes how Ashoka committed to Buddhism after seeing the suffering that was caused by his destructive war against the Kalingans. And in here we have 3 or 4 instances of King Beloved of the Gods Priyardasan or Beloved of the Gods in the third person, right? You look at the second paragraph, though, there. Now that the country of the Kalingas have been taken, Beloved of the Gods is devoted to a zealous study of morality, ... This is the repentance of Beloved of the Gods, ... For this is considered very painful by Beloved of the Gods, ... So he does seem to refer to himself a lot in inscriptions in the third person. The second objection, or the second issue of authenticity put up by Wikipedia, is the way that the Buddha is referred to. So this is just one word on the inscription. It says the qualifier used for the Buddha in the inscription is Sakyamuni, which is, it says, a partly Sanskritized form of the Prakrit Sakamuni. Prakrits being local languages that people wrote in ancient India that were derived from Sanskrit. So Sanskrit is the more classical form, and sometimes you get Sanskritized forms, which kind of revert more to the classical forms. So this notes that this form, Sakyamuni, is a partly Sanskritized form of Sakamuni, but it's not fully Sanskritized form. That would be Shakyamuni. So it has these 2 elements, Sha and Kya, which would make it fully Sanskritized. So it's sort of halfway there. And the problem here, says Wikipedia, is that the rest of the inscription is entirely in Prakrit, and Sanskrit inscriptions are not otherwise attested before the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. It also notes that Sakyamuni only appears in the Lumbini inscription, and if we look at other inscriptions from around the same time and similar places, so for example Piprahua, which may or may not be the site of Kapilavastu, the Buddha's birth city, as we'll see later on in this video, they have different forms. They have Sakya, Saka, Saka, Shaka, etc. Third issue is that the inscription, by all accounts, was very freshly cut. So the engraving is in extremely good condition. It seems fresh, arguably because the portion of the pillar which contains the inscription remained underground for so long, right? So that's the possibility that this is an authentic inscription that Ashoka put there in the 3rd century BC. And the pillar was, surrounded by dirt so quickly that it wasn't exposed to the air or to the elements or to, prying people or animals or plants for a very long time. So it was preserved very well. Still, when Rhys Davids, the legendary scholar who was the co-founder of the Pali Text Society, which put out a whole edition of ancient Buddhist suttas or sutras, to use the Sanskrit word. When Rhys Davids made a copy of the inscription in 1900, he noted that it was, quote, almost as if freshly cut. Following re-examination 50 years later, academics, and here Wikipedia is referring to Dutt and Bajpai, they commented, the pillar bears an inscription of Ashoka, very well preserved. The lines are straight and the letters very tastefully written. And most importantly, it appears as if the inscription has been very recently incised. So very recently, well, could that be only a few weeks, a few months, maybe even a few hours? And if so, then what we have is a forged inscription. And for me, the fourth issue, which Wikipedia doesn't note like this, but I will, I'll dedicate a whole fourth item here to Dr. Führer. For me, the big issue here is Alois Anton Führer's involvement, because this man was obviously a talented scholar, but he was also a notorious forger. He was found out, he was exposed at some point. There are dozens of forged documents and artifacts on record as having been made up and presented falsely by Führer. So these include Brahmi inscriptions from Mathura and Ramnagar. He was caught forging inscriptions in the capital of Astu, a modern municipality named after the Buddha's birth city. He sold forged relics of the Buddha, including a horse's tooth, presented as a tooth of the Buddha. And that's actually the one that led to Führer's downfall, when a British archaeologist working in Burma actually daubed in Führer, actually reported Führer for this forgery, and that led to other archaeologists discovering more and more forgeries by Führer. And he was forced to step down from his position and on the Archaeological Service of India, and he was also forced to withdraw his whole monograph on the topic we've been talking about, the Buddha's birthplace. It is this monograph published in 1897, not very creatively, entitled Monograph on Buddha Shakyamuni's Birthplace in the Nepalese Tarai, that is the Nepalese lowlands. That was actually fully withdrawn because the scholarly community and the publisher decided that it was probably going to cause more harm than good if they let it stay out there. It was misleading. It couldn't be relied on as a work of scholarship. All right, so let's go back through these issues of authenticity. The first one is that the inscription talks about Ashoka in the third person. I'm not sure I understand this objection because, as we've seen, other edicts and other inscriptions of Ashoka do seem to talk about him in the third person. The second problem is that there's this one word that is partially Sanskritized. Sakyamuni instead of Prakrit Sakamuni. But it is just one word, right? It's not an entire inscription in Sanskrit, and that one word isn't even completely in Sanskrit. So the problem is we don't get full Sanskrit inscriptions until later. In other words, we don't get inscriptions in which every word is in Sanskrit until later. But note that this isn't actually an inscription that's fully in Sanskrit. It's not even an inscription that has one word that's fully in Sanskrit. It's an inscription that has one word that's partly in Sanskrit. So that's important to bear in mind. I don't think that's really a smoking gun on its own. Third problem is this idea that the inscription looks freshly cut. And that is a bit fishy because when Ashoka put up this inscription, if we assume that he did, we assume that it would have been taken good care of for a few years. It wouldn't have been, very quickly or immediately filled in with dirt around the bottom. So that means that it probably, if it's genuine, it probably would have been exposed to the elements for at least decades, maybe a few hundred years. I have seen a lot of 4th century BC Greek inscriptions that do look freshly cut. So it can be the case that you have ancient inscriptions that look very well preserved. So this one, I think, isn't decisive. It could just be a very well preserved inscription, or it could be a forgery. And as I said before, I think the thing that really raises major doubts in my mind, even though there's no sort of smoking gun internal to the inscription or to the artifact, is the involvement of this guy, Alois Anton Führer, who's not only fishy, he's someone who was demonstrated to have forged inscriptions. And not only inscriptions, not only artifacts to do with Indian history, artifacts and inscriptions, inscriptions in Brahmi and artifacts to do with the Buddha and the Buddha's birthplace. And this is, of course, one of the most important inscriptions and artifacts to do with the Buddha's birthplace. We know that Führer not only forged these artifacts, but he was also selling artifacts that he knew would be important to pious Buddhists. And so it would almost be strange if he hadn't tried to forge an inscription to do with the Buddha's birthplace. So was Lumbini really the Buddha's birthplace? Um, and this is kind of a big question. I mean, it's a big question for me, I suppose, because I went there, but that's okay. It was a nice place anyway. There was a lot of interesting things to see there. It was interesting to see all the other pilgrims from the Buddhist world. But obviously, there's more than that that's hanging on this. The Buddha's birthplace is actually surrounded by a vast complex nowadays that's almost 5 kilometers long by almost 2 kilometers wide, and it has a canal. It has temples built by Buddhist countries all around the world. This is one put up by a Japanese Buddhist community, a stupa, and it has a fair few visitors, more than 1.5 million a year before COVID measures came in, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's back up to something like that. Today, most of them are Nepalese, a good number of them are Indian, and also a good number of them come from probably mostly other Buddhist countries, but also Canada, the UK, New Zealand, sometimes all three at once. And so it's no surprise that this site has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1997. And it's one of only 4 in Nepal, so there's a lot hanging on this for the Nepalese tourist industry, which is otherwise mostly trekking. And finally, it's important in its own right. This is the founder of one of the world's most popular religions. I think it's interesting to people all over the world, even people who aren't Nepalese, who don't have a stake in the Nepalese tourist industry, or who aren't interested in Buddhism in any spiritual way. It's important to know where the Buddha was born as accurately as we can. I mean, maybe we can't know, but it's important, I think, historically to get this right. So where was he born? Was he born in Nepal, or was he born in India? So before we talk more about this, I'm actually going to go back to the second video that I did on site, and I'm going to talk a little bit more there about the context that the Buddha was born into, and then I'm going to follow that up by another presentation where I'll go into that question more deeply, because it's really important to understand the context, the world that the Buddha was born into, before we go back and try and answer this big question: where was the Buddha really born? Right, so we're still here in Lumbini, the birthplace of the Buddha. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the history of the era that the Buddha was born in. So he was born into a clan, Shakya, the Shakya clan. That's why he's known as Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakya. So this was an era when northern India had a lot of these states, or even sort of associations. Gana Sangha is the word. There's a lot of debate about what exactly this meant, but they could be clans like the Shakya, or they could also be confederacies of clans like the Vrijis. And there are also states or statelets associated with these, the Indian city-states of the 6th to the 3rd centuries BC. And some of these were kingdoms, and some of these were more republican or oligarchic. And it was in one of these states, Magadha, that the Buddha was born into. And he, in fact, tailored his message to the people of Magadha. He was speaking in the dialect of Magadha. And that's the world he was born into. Obviously, it was soon to change. By the 3rd century BC, this area had been taken over. Well, even by the 4th century BC, this area had been taken over by this new empire, the Mauryan Empire, which was pioneered by Chandragupta Maurya. But 2,500 years later, it's still a revered spot where the Buddha was born. Okay, so what I was right about in that video was that the Buddha was born into this world of Ganasangas, associations, often based on kinship, and of Janapadas, these city-states that flourished between the 6th and the 3rd centuries BC. Sometimes they were Maha Janapadas. Maha just means great, so the great states. And this culture was flourishing in the Indo-Gangetic Plain and also up into the Terai, the kind of lowlands just south of the Himalayas. This was in northern India and in southern Nepal. Now, one of the only other sources that we have for the Buddha's birth at Lumbini are the Jataka. The Jataka are stories about the Buddha's previous lives. You can get a flavor of them or a taste of them by looking at this relief from Gandhara. What this relief shows is the Buddha in the form of a woodpecker taking a bone out of the mouth of a lion. He's fully in the maw of the lion, and he's taking the bone out because the Buddha, of course, embodies compassion. So these Jataka are stories about the Buddha's previous lives, but we also have the Nidanakatha, an introduction to the Jataka, and this focuses on the Buddha's birth into his main life, as it were, the life that he's most famous for, his life as a human, someone who was born into the Shakya clan. So the Nidana tells us the following things about the Buddha, the historic Buddha. He was born into the Shakya clan. This is why he's known, as I was right about in the video, in the clip, where I'm actually in Lumbini, that he is known as Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakyas. The Nidana also tells us that he was born near the city of Kapilavastu. It tells us he was born to Suddhodana of Kapilavastu and Maya of Devadaha, a prince and a princess from two nearby towns who later became king and queen. And it tells us that he was born in a pleasure grove of sala trees that was between the two towns, that is the towns of Kapilavastu and Devadaha, a pleasure grove which was called the Lumbini Grove. There's some sala trees. Maybe that's what the Lumbini Grove looked like back in the day. At any rate, here we have the crucial name, Lumbini. During the Buddha's lifetime, one of these Janapadas, one of these states, took over Kapilavastu. In fact, it sacked Kapilavastu. So King Vidudaba of Kosala invaded. He destroyed the Buddha's hometown, and this became a traditional element in the life of the Buddha, that the Buddha saw his own town destroyed, sacked, burned to the ground, and he mourned. He felt grief over this. And of course, this is used today in contemporary Buddhism to remind people, it's one of the many stories in contemporary Buddhism, to remind people that we all experience suffering. It's one of the Four Noble Truths. So, and also, of course, that everything is transient, including states, including clans, including cities, including the city of Kapilavastu. So, Buddha wasn't born in Magadha. I should be clear about that because that's what I was wrong about in that video. He wasn't born in Magadha, which is a state which was a bit further away down on the bottom right-hand part of this map. Though it is true that his movement really got going in Magadha. So Bodh Gaya, where he supposedly reached enlightenment, was in Magadha. Vulture Peak, where he gave many of his most famous sermons, including the Heart Sutra, was in Magadha. Sarnath, I'm not so sure of. It may be that Magadha was bigger than it looked on this map. I don't think we're quite sure about where Magadha was. Of course, it all depends as well on when you think the Buddha was around. Sarnath is on the outskirts of Varanasi, and that's where the first Buddhist Sangha, the first community, really got going. But at any rate, a lot of important things in the Buddha's life happened in Magadha. It is true that he seems to have tailored his message to people in Magadha. He seems to have used Magadhi, the language. So, where was Kapilavastu? Where was the city that he was from that was later destroyed? Here we have two main candidates. Number one, Tilarakot in Nepal. Number two, Piprahua in India. These are two archaeological sites that have been excavated reasonably extensively. They've been studied intensively. And I'm really just going to have to park that and not talk about it anymore. I was very tempted to dive into this because both of these sites have issued in so many interesting finds, and there's such a big debate about which one of these sites was Kapilavastu. But it's not actually directly relevant to what we're talking about here. Really, the only thing that's important for what we're talking about here is that both of these sites are close enough to Lumbini. They're close enough to be reassuring. So, we need Lumbini, where we think Lumbini was, to be close enough to Kapilavastu so that it coheres with the stories. That Lumbini wasn't far away from Kapilavastu, where the Buddha's father was from. And both of these sites, whether it's Tilarakot or whether it's Piprahua that was really Kapilavastu, they're both close enough to Lumbini for it to make sense. Having said all that, how do we know that the modern site of Lumbini really was the site of ancient Lumbini? If it's just the pillar, if we say, well, it's just the pillar of Ashoka, then we have the big problem that, as I've talked about in the earlier part of this video, this pillar may well be forged. And even if it wasn't forged by Alois Anton Führer, and it was actually erected by Ashoka in the 3rd century BC, well, Ashoka himself may have been wrong. Ashoka may put the pillar in the wrong place because he was acting on insufficient or false information. Maybe he didn't really know where it was, and he knew he didn't really know where it was, but he thought, I need to put up another pillar, and I want to have a cult site here, so I'll put it here. Someone might say, well, of course it's Lumbini. You can go to modern Lumbini. There's a huge shrine there, and so the people around that site call it Lumbini, And so surely that's what it was called in the ancient world too. But of course, this is extremely unreliable. Modern place names are often a very unreliable guide to ancient places because traditions can arise that, this was where the famous site of this was, and actually it could just not be true, could be inaccurate. Führer as well actually seems to have made up the claim that locals called this site Rumende. He came out and said locals I've talked to call this site Rumende. It sounds a bit like Lumbini or Lumbini, and that doesn't seem to have been the case. They probably call it something like Rupadevi. As for local traditions, as I've said, these are often highly unreliable. But the important question here is there any evidence that this was seen as a Buddhist holy site before or separately from Ashoka? In other words, is there independent evidence that this site received Buddhist cult or Buddhist attention separate from this pillar that Ashoka put up? As we've seen, the pillar that Ashoka put up, even if it was Ashoka, that's unreliable. And the answer for a long time was no. There's no real independent evidence that this site had anything to do with the Buddha before or separately from this pillar or this inscription. Until 2013. So in 2013, these British archaeologists published their findings, and what they were claiming was that there is evidence for a wooden structure from the 6th century BC, which was discovered below the Maya Devi temple. The Maya Devi temple being the large white building you can see behind me in the clips I've taken at the site itself. So what they did is they dug down, and if you go to Lumbini today, you go inside the Maya Devi temple. You can't film in it, or I wasn't able to, but there are several layers of structures, and some of these structures are courtyards with an open space in the middle, mostly brick, or several layers of that are brick. And what these British archaeologists did is dig down below all those layers, and they've published their findings saying, we actually think there is the lowest level, the building, the first building, which was made of wood in the 6th century BC. So that's extremely significant for a whole number of reasons. One of which is there's this big debate about when the Buddha was even around. Was he born in the 6th century BC? Was he born in the 5th century BC? And so if this is really a Buddhist shrine, a wooden Buddhist shrine from the 6th century BC, then of course the Buddha would have to have been born in the 6th century BC as well, or before, but probably in the 6th century BC. So it's extremely significant, and what they think it was this wooden structure around an unroofed courtyard. As I say, it's continuous with later structures of the same sort. Here is a picture from the publication where you can see the lumps on the right there, which they've suggested are holes which would have held posts. And they also found some organic material that they analyzed, and they suggest that they actually may have been tree roots back in the day. And that suggests to the archaeologists that this may have been a tree shrine. Now, tree shrines are something that we see later on in the Buddhist tradition in Southeast Asia, for example. And we also see, for example, in Bodh Gaya. So this bas-relief shows Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha was supposed to have reached enlightenment. And what we have there is a stone screen. Maybe before that was a wooden, not a screen, sorry, a set of railings. And so it was a stone set of railings at some point, which I'll talk about in another video. And before that, there was a set of wooden railings. And so what you would have had, as depicted in this bas-relief, was a sacred tree in the middle, and then that would have been enclosed by these railings. And the tradition states that Maya Devi, the Buddha's mother, gave birth holding on to a tree branch. So it makes sense to think that people came up to this tree, or at least a tree, and they said, this is the tree that the Buddha's mother gave birth next to, and so let's venerate it. And that happened pretty close, after the Buddha was born, or at least after the Buddha became famous. The people went to the area where they thought he was born, and they either knew the exact tree somehow, or they picked a tree and said, this is going to be the one. Anyway, even if it wasn't the exact tree, maybe they got, the area approximately right. There would have been people still alive who remembered the Buddha, etc. So, was the Buddha born in Nepal? So this is a big question. I'm aware it's a big question because even during my brief time in Nepal, I became aware that this is now a big point of pride. Now, of course, most Nepalese are in fact Hindu rather than Buddhist, but I also saw during my brief time there that the Buddha is widely venerated. Maybe something to do with the more open-minded ways of polytheism, that you can venerate different gods without the sort of main god being too pissed off. The Buddha, of course, is sometimes seen as an incarnation of Vishnu, but even separately from all that, the Buddha is just a very important person in global cultural history. He's world famous. He's the founder of one of the world's most popular religions. And so it's understandable this has become a point of pride. I even saw a bumper sticker in Kathmandu saying in English, Buddha was born in Nepal. So, was he actually born in Nepal? Answer, yes, in this sense. So Lumbini is definitely inside the boundaries of the modern state of Nepal. So the modern state of Nepal is shown on this map, and you can see Kapilavastu, or Kapilavastu is shown there. That's actually not so certain. As I've said, there's one site that we think was Kapilavastu, that we think might have been Kapilavastu, that's in Nepal. There's another site that we think might have been Kapilavastu, that's in India. So that may not be reliable, but definitely Lumbini, the modern site, that's in Nepal. I just went there a few weeks ago. You can drive over the border from India, you can fly down from Kathmandu like I did, but that is definitely within the modern state of Nepal. There's a casino on site or nearby at a hotel I stayed in, weirdly enough, that would only be allowed in Nepal. I'm told that gambling isn't allowed in the northern states of India. So Lumbini is in Nepal. But those who say that the Buddha was Indian, or that he was born in India, in a sense, that's correct as well. So it's correct in the sense that Buddha was born into this world which was Indian. If we use Indian as a kind of geographical expression, when historians talk about India, they're really talking about, for most of the period that historians discuss, the vast period, vast different periods of Indian history, they're really talking about the subcontinent and the cultures that grew up on the subcontinent. And in this period, we talk about the Janapadas or the Mahajanapadas, and this is an Indian world in that sense, in that loose sense. And this is really the culture that the Buddha was born into. Kapilavastu, Shakya clan, they all partook of this culture. It was a culture that was continuous with the Indo-Gangetic Plain. It reached down, I think even into central India. It wasn't so much continuous with the Himalayas in a way that you might want if you wanted to say, oh, actually, the Buddha was Nepalese. In the end, of course, it's kind of a silly way of thinking about it. The Buddha wasn't born in either Nepal or India. He wasn't born in the modern state of Nepal. He wasn't born in the modern state of India. The modern state of Nepal, of course, only got going in the 18th century with the Kingdom of Nepal. The modern state of India only got going after the Second World War. The Buddha didn't have a Nepalese passport. He didn't have an Indian passport. He wasn't using Nepalese rupees. He wasn't using Indian rupees. I've seen somewhere on Twitter that facts don't care about your feelings. Well, ancient history doesn't care about your modern debates, and it doesn't care about your modern nationalisms. So the Buddha wasn't really born in Nepal. He wasn't really born in India, if we use those terms in a modern sense. But he was almost certainly born in Lumbini. And I say that more confidently at the end of this video because of that find in 2013. If the archaeologists are wrong about there being a wooden structure there, or if they're wrong about that wooden structure being a Buddhist shrine, then of course it all hangs on this one thread of the inscription that was found on this pillar or associated with this pillar. And then it's very problematic because, as we've seen, that inscription may have been a forgery planted by Führer. Even if it wasn't, if it was actually put there by Ashoka when he erected a pillar, then that's not quite decisive either, because then we have to ask the question, well, how did he know, how did Ashoka know that this was really the site that the Buddha was born? And the only thing that gets us out of that is if there's a continuous tradition of cult. And so that's why the wooden structure is so important, because it suggests that there was a continuous tradition of cult that started very near the time of the Buddha's birth. I'm not an expert on this topic. If you know more than me, please write in the comments. I'd also suggest that you have a look at the further reading I've put below this video. There's a whole book by Charles Allen, which, as I understand, goes into a lot of these issues in a lot of detail. I haven't read it. I haven't read a lot of the literature on this thoroughly. I really did this just because I did a pilgrimage and I wanted to deepen my experience and learn more. So I hope you've enjoyed this video as much as I've enjoyed making it.